My name is Kevin Fleming, and I'm the Popular Music and Culture Archivist at Georgia State University. Today's date is October 20th, 2017, and I'm conducting an oral history interview with John Long.
Hello.
John, where were you born?
I was born in Waynesburg, Pennsylvania.
And how long did you spend your childhood there, or growing up, or did you move shortly
I spent
there?
a few months there. My father was a Baptist minister, and that was his first pastorate. Upon graduating from seminary, he and my mom got married. They both were from North Carolina, and his first pastorate was in Waynesburg, Pennsylvania, in Greene County, a little tiny burg south of Pittsburgh. And so they moved there, and I was born shortly thereafter, or well, I don't know how long. I don't know when they moved there, but anyway, and we stayed there just a brief few months, and then my father decided he wanted to go back to school and get his doctorate in theology, so we moved to Fort Worth, Texas.
And at what point did you come to Georgia?
Well, we lived in Fort Worth until Dad got his doctorate. Then we moved to Pensacola, Florida, where he was minister at a church there by the base, the Navy base there. Then we moved to North Carolina to Greensboro, and we lived there for a few years, and I started school there, and then we moved to Rossville, Georgia, which is just south of Chattanooga. So until I was about in the, well, I guess until it was time for me to go to high school, we lived in Rossville, and then we moved to LaGrange, Georgia in 1959.
And how old were you then?
I was 15.
Okay, so high school.
Yeah, 15, yeah.
Okay. Was your mother a homemaker, or did she have a profession as well?
Mom was a homemaker until about the time I started. We got to LaGrange actually, and LaGrange College was there, and my mother had been to college because she and my dad met at the school over in South Carolina, and the name of it slips me now. It's Jones something. It's a theological, or not theological, but a religious college. But that's where they met, and she never finished. They got married, so she had always wanted to finish school. So she went back. She went to school at LaGrange College, and she graduated in 1962, the same year my sister graduated from elementary school, and that I graduated from LaGrange High School. So our picture was in the paper, and it was a triple graduation year.
Did you just have the one sibling, your sister?
Yeah.
Okay.
My sister's the only one I got.
Okay. What first sparked your interest in radio?
When we lived in Greensboro, North Carolina, my dad used to go to a radio station there, and I don't remember how often. It seemed like it was pretty regular. He would go there early in the morning to do a daily devotion on the air. It was back when radio stations actually did that. Mm-hmm. And so he would wake me up, and it would be dark, and he would take me with him to the radio station. And while he was in the studio doing his daily devotional, I was in the back looking at all the big cabinets filled with tubes and hearing the sound of these old transmitters made. And I was fascinated with the electronics of it all, and it just it was fascinated me. And then when we moved to Rossville, Georgia, he had in his office at the church, he had a little studio where he recorded, instead of going to the radio stations, he would actually record these little devotionals for the radio station in Chattanooga to play. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I would go to work with him at the church when I wasn't in school, and he would let me go in there, and there was a wire recorder, which nobody except old guys like me probably remember wire recorders. But he would let me get in there, and he had a phonograph, and he would let me play. I listened to the radio all the time, anyway, and he would let me play disc jockey, and so I learned. That's how I kind of got interested in it that way. And then I really didn't. After that, I think I got more interested in girls and cars than anything else. But when I got to LaGrange College, which was the year after I graduated in '62, they formed. They had a radio club, and they did a weekly thing on WTRP, and I joined. It was an extracurricular activity, and in the process of doing that, I have to back up a minute because I was already interested in radio, and I don't know what sparked me to get reinterested after being away from it so long. But I used to listen to the radio all the time to faraway stations in Chicago, and I listened to the Atlanta stations from LaGrange, and WQXI was my station. Anyway. So when I got to that summer before I got to college, for some reason I was a big fan of Jerry Lewis's, and so I decided I wanted to get a job at the radio station. So I went to WLAG and I talked to Ed Molinax, who was the owner, and he said, "Well, I don't even really have any openings, but you can come by and watch me if you like." So I went by and he let me turn a few knobs and things like that. And then I went out to see Byron Hurst at WTRP. He was one of three brothers, the Hurst brothers, who owned WTRP. And I told him what I wanted to do, and he said, "Why in the world do you want to be in radio?" A question I've asked myself many, many times. But anyway, he said, "Well, why don't you come out and be on my morning show?" He did a morning coffee talk show, I think about from 9 to 10 each morning at Randall's Restaurant in LaGrange, and they did it, live. And he said, "Why don't you come out?" Because he asked me, he said, "Well, have you done any acting or anything like that?" I said, "Well, no. Well, a little bit, but, well, who are some of your heroes?" And I said, "Well, I love Jerry Lewis." I said, "I even do an imitation of Jerry Lewis." And so he said, "Well, why don't you come and do your imitation of Jerry Lewis?" So I went and did my imitation of Jerry Lewis on I forget what it was called. But anyway, I did that on the show, and I've got a picture of it. Or somebody took a picture of it. Me. I dressed up in a painter's uniform, took a bucket of confetti, and a bit that Jerry Lewis used to do is he'd stumble, he'd dress like a painter, he'd stumble, and instead of paint in the bucket, there would be confetti. So anyway, I did that. Well, I guess he felt beholding unto me, so he offered me a job. No money, but he offered me a job doing a Saturday morning show called the Top 20 on 620. And so that's how I started my radio career at WTRP in LaGrange. I started school that fall at LaGrange College, and because I was doing that little show on WLAG, I got interested in the radio thing at LaGrange College. And I was on that club, or in that club, and helped produce those shows.
Okay. Was this, I have it in my notes here that there was an issue with jingles from QXI. Was that at the same time period on that station? Or
well, actually, it was a little bit later because my Top 20 on 620 show led to an offer of a job to be able to work there while I was going to college, because the Hurst brothers liked to hire the local college kids to work at the station because, A, they worked cheap, and it also gave them experience. And so I was on vacation with my parents in North Carolina, and we were going through Canton, North Carolina, if I remember correctly. And I was listening to a station. I bugged my dad all the time. I controlled the radio in the car. And so we were turning across, and I found this station in Canton, and I heard a jingle, which is a little musical signature of the call letters of the radio station. And they were the same ones they used on WQXI, my favorite station in Atlanta at that time. And so I didn't make my dad, but I asked my dad, said, "Please stop by the station and let me just go in and say hello to the guy and ask him where they got those." And I did, and just so happened the guy gave me a tape of them. I brought them back to WTRP. I played some on the air. Well, I didn't know they were copyrighted. Kent Burkhardt was the general manager of WQXI, and we began a lifelong friendship because of that, because he was coming through LaGrange going to the GAB convention at Callaway Gardens. He was listening to WTRP and just so happened to be listening to me in the afternoons. And there I was playing their jingles. And he quickly called this company in Dallas called Pam's, which made the best jingles of that time for top 40 stations, and said, there's a station in LaGrange, Georgia that's, playing our jingles and blah, blah, blah. And that's a violation of copyright, blah, blah, blah. And so Byron got a letter from Pam's with a cease and desist and a bill for thousands of dollars. So I got called in on the carpet on that. Well, just so happened that Kent was let me back up. Byron called Bill Sanders, who was the head of the Georgia Association of Broadcasters at that time, and said, do you know anybody at WQXI or PAMS? Here's what's happened. Well, they got it all resolved, and it all was chalked up to a stupid kid like me not knowing anything any better, just having fun on the radio. Right. And as I said, that started a lifelong friendship with Kent Burkhardt. We're friends to this day. So anyway, I got out of that, but believe me, I spent a couple of nights wondering how in the world I was, and I said thousands of dollars. It could have been $1,000, but that could have been $10 million to me then. Right. And I kept thinking, how in the world am I going to pay this? I told Byron, I said, I guess I'll work free for you for the rest of my college career and then a few years after to pay it back. So,
Okay. Staying within those early years, can you talk a little bit about your feelings about, or not so much feelings, but take on radio and the importance for communities like that, for smaller communities back in that time?
Well, one of the first things that you had to do if you're going to be on the radio was get a license, an third-class radio telephone operator's license. And to do that, you had to take a test and get it and send it off to the FCC office in Atlanta, and get and you got a little. I think they were blue back then. I'm not sure. I don't remember. It's been so long ago. But anyway, one of the things that you had to attest or swear to was that you would uphold the purpose of radio stations and the responsibility of radio stations, which was to serve the needs, problems, and interests of the community. It didn't say a word about your job is to make money, or your job is to hire college students, or your job is to do anything except serve the problems, needs, and interests of the community. And that's why radio stations back then, and I learned early, it was just standard operating procedure that we had news, public service announcements, that we did local involvement with charities, and any time that there was an emergency, we broadcast that. We gave the news. Matter of fact, back then you were required to do so much news and so much public service, and also keep records of all the correspondence with anybody that listened or asked anything. And those records had to be open to the public. Anytime anybody wanted to come in and see your license, they could come to the radio station and they could see your license and all the documentation. It was tightly regulated. So that's the way I was raised in radio. That radio was not a commodity. It wasn't like owning a convenience store or a department store. You were licensed by the government to serve the problems, needs, and interests of the community. Okay. And radio couldn't be further from that today.
Right. Seems like back then there was less emphasis on the music as well. It was part of the programming, but not the way it is now with the majority of the programming.
Well, yeah, music was a vital part of it, but it wasn't just one type of music, it was a variety of music. And rarely did you find a radio station that only played one type of music, unless it was a genre such as black music.
Right.
Now, that was different. I mean, they played black music, but they also had to serve the problems, needs, and interests of the community, and they did so with the black community very well. But you also had talk, like you had usually the owner of the radio station's wife was also the women's director, and she had a show every day or every once a week called Women's Talk or whatever, and they talked about recipes and sewing and all that kind of stuff. And then you had on Saturday mornings you might have the local university agronomists come in and talk about planting and seeds and growing vegetables and all that sort of thing. And it wasn't unusual to carry early in the morning the hog market report, about the stocks of the agriculture business, because that was a big part of where I grew up, at least in LaGrange. Agriculture was big, and so there was a lot of elements to it. And then of course the news, and usually you had to produce a local public affairs program, and so it was incumbent upon the owner or the news director or whoever got assigned that task to go out and find people in the community. And when I did it, when I was a part owner of a radio station, I went back to my roots, and that was the problems, needs, and interests of the community. So when I would do my public affairs show, I didn't have to come up with a bunch of questions for the guys, because what I would do is I was a member of some civic clubs, and I would go to the luncheons, like it was Rotary, go to a Rotary Club meeting, and I would pass out a questionnaire to all the Rotary members, who were generally the movers and shakers of the community, and ask them to please list the problems, needs, and interests of the community as they saw them. Well, that gave me a year's worth of programs, because I would, and 9 times out of 10 it would be the same 6 or 8, but you'd have different people you talk to. So yeah, radio was a lot different. We carried a lot. So there was a lot of different things that we programmed. It was variety radio.
Right. It sounds like it was more somewhat similar to some of the college stations now in terms of variety. I mean, the
True.
college stations don't have as much community interaction and activity, but in terms of variety, it sounds like
Absolutely.
they've retained that somewhat over the years.
Well, basically, you had
stations.
country music, you had beautiful music, or you had classical music, you had middle of the road music, you had top 40 music, and you had black music. So you had like 5 genres of music. There was plenty. There were Zydeco would be lumped in with something else. But the big 5 major ones were those.
Okay. And at the time, was that station 24-hour, or did it turn off at night, or
No, we were sun up to sunrise,
okay.
and once a month, when I got my full-time job there, not full-time. I never got a full-time job. I got a part-time. I was just part-time. But one of my Sundays a month, I signed on and stayed all day until sign off. And boy, were they fun in the winter months when the sun came up late and went down early. But in the summertime, it was some long days.
All right, that's good. Moving forward. Seems like around 63, you had your introduction with the Beatles and Paul Drew and
Yeah.
WQXI. Can you speak a little about that, how that came about?
I was sent to Callaway Gardens by WTRP to get to an interview with someone with the Masters water ski tournament. And at that time, the Beatles had this was like 63, right after the summer after they had really started to come into their own, the Beatles, I mean. And so I went to Callaway Gardens, and I met a guy with the British Water Ski Association. And the first question out of my mouth, because I was a fan of the Beatles, big time, and my first question was about the Beatles. He said, "Oh, they're members of our club. They come in water ski." And I said, "Oh, really? Tell me all about them." Blah, blah, blah. So my interviews about the water ski tournament went the way of finding more about the Beatles. And in the process, he said, "I have their new album." And I said, "Really? Could I see it?" So he showed it to me, and I looked at it, and I recognized immediately it had not been released in the U.S. My head was going a million miles an hour, and the first person I thought of was Paul Drew at WQXI, my favorite station, because Paul, who I'd never met, didn't know anything about, was the fifth Beatle. He was Mr. Beatle Atlanta. So I called him, and I talked to his wife, who's still a dear friend, and I told her what I had, and she said, "I'll have Paul call you back." He called me back, and he thought I was full of it. So anyway, he said, "Read the titles of the songs," and he knew more about them. He knew about their albums, being the ones in England that had not been released in the U.S. So he said, "Could you tape that and put it on a bus to me?" We didn't have FedEx back then. Anyway, so I sat down at the radio station, and we had a Wallensack tape recorder, which was not high quality at all. And I taped it, and I stayed up that night and put it on the late bus to Atlanta. And he called me at 2 or 3 in the morning when the bus got there. And he'd already been back to the studios and played the tape. And he said, "That tape is no good. Can you do it again?" I got up, went back to the station, did it again. He called me 6:30, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, whenever it was, or whenever I got out of class at LaGrange College. And he said, "That's not going to work either. Is that the best recorder you've got?" I said, "Yep." And he said, "Well, could you bring the album to Atlanta?" I said, "Well, I don't know. I'd have to talk. I didn't have a car. Or I didn't have one that would make it to Atlanta, I should say. I said, "I'll have to talk to my dad and see if I can get him to bring me up there, because he won't let me drive his car to Atlanta." And back then, driving to Atlanta was a big deal. Not as big a deal as it would be today, but it was still a big deal back then. So we didn't have any interstates. We didn't have many, not outside the metro Atlanta area, there weren't any interstates. So I talked to my dad into doing it, and I said, "Well, I tell you what," I called him back. I said, "My dad said he would do it as long as you pay for the gas." He said, "Okay, I'll give you $25 for the gas." Well, that was a fortune. I mean, that was five Phillips right there. So I said, "Okay, and one other thing, I would like 2 tickets to the Beatles concert in Jacksonville." He said, "No problem." So off we go to Atlanta. I walked into the studios. I was like a kid in a candy store. I walked in and met Andrew. And she said, "Just a minute." And he came out behind the glass, and I stood there watching him. And he came out, and he took me back to their big production room, and they had this wonderful equipment. He sat down, and he said, "Now, when it starts the last track on this side, come get me." So he rolled a big Ampex recorder and started playing the records. Well, I sat there, and the whole time I was sitting there, and all I'm doing is, it reminded me when I was a little tiny kid looking at all that equipment in the radio station, because it was all stuff that I had never seen before, because it was big time radio. So anyway, long story short, taped the album, got it back, because I had to take it back to the guy in Callaway Gardens, so I had to get it back to him. This all happened in the period of maybe 2 days, 3 at the most. And that started a lifelong relationship with Paul Drew. And I got the check for $25 for the gas, gave it to my dad. He was thrilled. I got the 2 tickets to the Beatles concert. I was thrilled. And my mother said, "How are you going to get there?" I said, "Well, I'm going to drive my car." Well, anyway, that's another long story altogether. But anyway, I wound up going to the Beatles concert. I met the Beatles for the first time, and it was a dream come true.
And correct me if I'm missing anything in between, but it seemed like around 64 is when you started to work as a promotion man for Mercury. Was there anything else in between that, between 63 and 64? That
Not really, no. I stayed in touch with Paul, and one of the questions I asked him was, I said, I don't get many records. I had written all the record companies asking for records, because we got very poor record service at WTRP. So I sat down and wrote to all of them, all the record companies I could find in the in the Billboard magazine. Billboard put out a directory of some sort or something. I don't know where I got all these addresses, but I wrote all the record companies and asked them for service. And Paul suggested that I go see the distributorships in Atlanta. So I went to Byron Hurst again, and I said, Byron, I can get us all the new releases. At that time, we were buying stuff that we needed from Glenn's Record Shop in LaGrange, which was our local record store. And I said, for what we spend on records, you give me $5 a week, and I'll go to Atlanta and I'll go to all the distributors to get them. So I was doing that. Well, I made a lot of lifelong friends in the process of doing that. And one day I walked in, I was down on Lucky Street at Southern Record Distributors, and I walked in and asked to see the guy that I normally got the records from, and the manager of the branch, which is what they call the distributors of the major labels, he said, the girl said, hold on just a minute. She went and got him. He came out. I said, I want to see whatever the guy's name was. Well, he doesn't work here anymore. I said, well, I'm here to get records. He said, well, we don't have a promotion man right now. Do you want the job? And I said, how much does it pay? He said, $75 a week, plus you get an expense account. I said, what do I do? He said, you go to all the radio stations and give them all the new releases. And your job is to get the songs played on the air. And I immediately forgot about my college education, my radio career, everything else in the world. All of a sudden, here I had a chance to move to Atlanta and go to all the radio stations. I was like, it was unbelievable. So I packed up. My mother cried because I left college, and I moved to Atlanta. And I wore saddle Oxford shoes and wingtips and pants with cuffs on them, and I looked like a Baptist preacher's son, which is exactly what I was. And the first thing that happened was I realized that I was not dressed correctly to be in the record business. So I had made friends with two guys that worked at WQXI, the all-night show. Their name is Tom and Paul Crimsier, but on the air they were Tom and Paul Collins, the Collins twins, and one of them made the comment to me, you got to do something about your clothes, man. So they took me shopping, and we bought me some peg pants and some shirts that looked a little more I looked like not a hippie, because they weren't hippies then, but I looked like, I don't know what I looked like. I looked like a hip guy. And they showed me where to buy a pair of zippered boots, which I thought was really cool because the Beatles wore zippered boots. Anyway, and I started my career as a record guy, and I went to all the radio stations in Atlanta, and I called on the music directors, and I gave them the records, and I told them about the records, and I knew which ones we were really pushing that week. And a lot of times we had major artists like Johnny Mathis and Roger Miller and James Brown and people like that. I didn't really have to promote those. I'd just walk in and give it to them, and they would immediately slap them on the turntable and start playing them, So anyway, my territory included all of Georgia, Alabama, and Eastern Tennessee. So I'd get in my car and I'd drive to Augusta, and that was my first trip. My first road trip was to Augusta, where I met another lifelong friend, Harley Drew, who was one of the founding board members of the Georgia Radio Hall of Fame. And Harley was at WBBQ, which is the big station in Augusta. And I met a guy in Savannah named Mel, and I can't remember his last name at the moment, but he was at a station there, and I can't remember the call letters at this moment. But there's also a station, WSGA, and then I went to, it seems like I went across the state to Columbus, and I would stop. Keep in mind, I'm driving, and I had a Diners Club card, so I mean I could stay in a hotel and buy my gas and eat whatever I wanted to do or whatever. And I had a somewhat expensive account. I mean, so if I wanted to take hardly do right to lunch, I could. But as I would drive across the state, and every time I'd be driving down the road, and keep in mind there were no interstates, not many interstates then. So as I'm driving along, somebody had told me, and I don't remember who it was, when I said to them, well, what do I do? How do I do this job? They said, well, you get in your car and you start driving, and every radio tower you see, you stop and you give them records. And that's the way you get your records played. So I did that. And I'd stop at every time I saw a radio tower, I'd stop, go in, introduce myself. Many times they'd never seen a record guy in their life. And they were thrilled. And I'd be pulling out of the parking lot and I'd hear my songs on the radio. They were already playing them because they were so unaccustomed, like I was back then, of not getting any service, that they were thrilled that they got, records. So anyway, I did that. I went to Columbus. And I remember walking into a station over in, it was actually located just across the Alabama line, WCLS. That was a top 40 station. There was also a big station there called WDAK, Big Johnny Red. And I called on them and their music director or program director, whoever it was. And then I would come back up the road to Atlanta, and I don't remember if I stopped. I'd stop in Carrollton, Union, along the way. I'd make the trip as long as I could. It was like a week-long vacation for me. Because here I am, young, single, dressed incredibly hip, and here I'm going across the state, Mr. Big Deal record guy. And so that's how I got into the record business, and I stayed in it for a while, and then I couldn't stand it. I was in radio stations all the time, yet I wasn't on the radio.
Right.
So I had to get back into radio. So I did.
Were the records mainly singles or LPs at the time, or
both?
Both.
The singles went to by that time radio had gone through somewhat of a transformation, and formats started to develop. So instead of a station just playing a top 40 music for 3 hours in the afternoon, like I did on WTRP, they would be playing top 40 all day long. Then there would be country stations that played country all day long. And of course the black stations, in addition to playing black gospel, they played black music all the time, or soul music. WSB in Atlanta was it was a big thrill to go there because I met a guy named Bob Van Camp, who was the music director. And Bob, they played a variety of music, a little bit of top 40, a little MOR. I don't remember them playing much country at all. Occasionally they'd play a country record, like they'd play a Roger Miller record. But that was a big thrill to meet Bob Van Camp because I listened to him, I heard him on the radio, and so I knew who he was. And that was kind of fun to be able to hear, meet guys that I had heard on the radio, because the first thing I did when I got to Atlanta, I started listening to all the stations. One of the trips that I made, and I say trips because back then it was a trip, to go to Marietta from Atlanta. There was no Interstate 75, at least not past the river. And so you went on Highway 41 to, somebody said, the Smash Records guy, Smash Records regional guy, whose name was Romeo Davis, said to me, have you been to see Jim Davenport at WFOM in Marietta? And I said, no, I don't know who that is. He said, well, you need to read your Gavin report, because that back then we had the Billboard chart, Cashboard chart, and then there was a sheet that came out once a week called the Gavin report, done by a guy named Bill Gavin out of San Francisco. And it listed all the top 40 songs. It was top 40 oriented. And he had reporters from all over the country. One of those reporters was Paul Drew. And I think the guy at PLO was also a reporter, because WPLO was WQXI AM's competition. But anyway, he said, well, if you've been looking at your Gavin report, you notice that there is a reporter in Marietta at WFOM. His name is Jim Davenport. You need to go see him. I went and met Jim Davenport. We became lifelong friends. As a matter of fact, he was almost like a father to me, because he liked me for some reason, and he looked at me. Now that I think about it, and I'll tell a story about how my clothes, I think I kind of left out the fact that Jim Davenport is the one that looked at me in my wingtip shoes and cuffed pants and said to me, you need to do something about your clothes. So the Collins twins took me to shopping. So anyway, I met Jim and I promoted him on records, and we became fast friends at WFM in Marietta. He later became a promotion man, by the way.
Oh. With just curious about how the process worked with the promotion. Obviously, if a station had the Gavin report, they would be able to. You wouldn't have to push a particular song too much if it was, in print somewhere saying that. Basically, my question would be, how did you go about convincing someone if you had a new record and there was basically a new group or a new song that wasn't popular yet? How did you go about convincing them to play that song?
We paid them. No, I'm kidding. No, we didn't. We didn't. That did go on, but
right.
I didn't do it. I didn't have the budget for that.
On a small tangent off of that, was that actually happening at that time period, or was that later on?
Oh, it was happening.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, what you did was, being a record promotion man was a lot like being a salesman. A successful sales guy, at least I think, if it still exists this way. It was all about relationships. So you tried to build a relationship with the program director or the music director, and you would say to him, "Hey, listen, first thing you had to do was be honest with him. If the regional manager for the record company or the national manager, promotion manager, had said on the conference call that week, we need this record this week, we need as many call letters as you can possibly get so that we can get it to chart with Gavin. We need reports, because that's how he based it on the reporting stations. So I go to Harley Drew and say, Harley, these are the records that I got to work this week. I got to work these records, and I'd listen to them, and if I liked them, or if I thought they had merit, I would really, really push hard. Mm-hmm. If they were so, I just say, here's a record. I'm getting a lot of pressure about this record. You decide if it was something I really liked and I believed, because I had a pretty good ear for music. I picked a lot of hit records. Mm-hmm. I just had, for some reason, I could hear something, and I listened as a listener, and I thought, I'd like to hear that on the radio. Anyway, so the way you got it played was hopefully you had a relationship with the program director or music director, and you convinced him that the record was worthy of a shot on the playlist. And like I said earlier, jokingly, in many instances there were situations where some of these people expected something in return. I'll tell a quick story about that. One station that I called on, I learned quickly from a guy who's still a friend of mine today, who I met when I first got to Atlanta. His name is Larry King. He worked for a distributorship there in Atlanta. And I said to Larry, what do you do about this station? And he said, well, the first thing you do is when you go into the guy's office, you carry an album box, and in the box you have several bottles of Johnny Walker Red, and you just take that box and you seal it up, and you put your records in there and put the Johnny Walker in there too. And what you do when you walk in his office, you just put it over in the corner, and it'll be over there with several other boxes, and that was your price of admission to get in to see the guy. Now, whether that's payable, I don't know, but it was common practice.
Right. That's what.
As far as money, I was approached several times. What's it worth to you? It's worth my job. That's basically the answer, because we were drilled. At least I was, and the other guys I knew, because I didn't know any guys that paid anybody, but I knew it went on.
Right.
So anyway.
And with the Southern Record Distributors, did they deal with just one record label, or was it Capitol, Mercury, and Columbia? Well,
they were the distributorship for Mercury and its subsidiary labels. Okay. So it was Mercury, Smash, Phillips. It was Limelight, which was their jazz album, and they had a classical, and I can't remember the name of it now. I've still got some of the records that I used, albums. I've got an Edith Piaf collection. that's probably, hopefully, priceless. And I got a lot of great jazz. Terry Mulligan is one of my favorite jazz artists, and I've got a lot of his albums that I promoted.
Okay. So how many years did you work as a promotion man?
Altogether, maybe 3. Because I did it twice.
Well, in this first stint, I guess.
The first stint, I was there, maybe a year.
Okay.
Maybe a year. The general manager of the distributorship, he had come. Phillips Records was owned by Phillips Electronics out of England, or Sweden, or Norway somewhere, and they also had a book division. This guy was in charge of the book division in the Southeast, and when the distributorship didn't have a GM, they decided to let him run it, and he didn't know anything about it, nor did he care anything about it. In addition to, the distributorship had books, records, and phonographs, Phillips phonographs. So anyway, he got replaced, and he was replaced by a guy from Miami, and I can't remember his name now. I will in a minute. But anyway, the guy in Miami, he and his brother were big record distributors in Atlanta. They owned a distributorship, and they distributed Mercury. But they had a lot of other lines. There were distributorships that handled multiple lines, but they were generally smaller labels. But Mercury had its own because it was so big, and it was Southern. And why it was called that, I don't know. But anyway, Frank Riles was the guy who was replaced, who gave me the job. And this guy, Steve Brookmeyer, that's who it was, Brookmeyer. Manny and Steve Brookmeyer, they owned a distributorship in Miami. Steve became the branch manager in Atlanta. Steve dressed the way I should have dressed when I walked in the door, only his clothes were very expensive. And his hair was, Steve could have had a part in the Godfather. I mean, that's the kind of guy he looked like. Okay, he was Jewish. He wasn't Italian.
Right.
But and he was suave, and I'll never forget one quick story. He came in, took one look at me, and I could tell he didn't like me. You know, I just instinctively knew that he didn't like me, so that was okay. But he walked in. The funny thing was, he walked in to my office within a week, maybe after, and he put a big pile of shirts on my desk. And I said, okay, well, thank you. What do you want me to do? He said, those are my shirts. Take them to the laundry, have them done, light starch, put it on your expense account, and bring them back to me. Okay, fine. So that's the way Steve got his laundry done, by the promotion man getting in. So if that tells you anything about the kind of manager he was, okay? I didn't last very long because I just wasn't hip enough for him. So he hired a hipper guy, and so that's when I decided to get back in radio.
And where did you go at that point?
I decided that I had made a big mistake by dropping out of college. I decided that I needed to go back to college. Well, I couldn't get in right then, so I was working part-time for Jim Davenport out in Marietta, but I had gotten a call from Red Jones at WQXI, who lived in Cobb County, which was the end of the earth back then, and he lived in Cobb County, and he was the program director at WQXI. He called me one night and said, how'd you like to work weekends at WQXI? And I said, absolutely. And so I told Jimmy Davenport, I said, Red Jones called me and he wants me to work there. I figured he's going to be mad. And he said, that's great. Fabulous. So I went to work there, and I was working at WQXI part-time. Well, in the interim, I had to find another job, so I found a job at WLBB in Carrollton, Georgia. So I was working there. Well, the guy who was the program director was so jealous of the fact that I worked at WQXI that he assigned me to shifts. I did mornings and afternoons. And I still lived in LaGrange, so I drove back and forth to Carrollton and worked there. And after a while, that got really old. Plus I got fired in Carrollton because the guy finally he consented, particularly when I played my interview with the Beatles on there. He got really mad then because it was really jealous, and he fired me. So anyway, I decided it was time to go back to college, so I went back to college, and that didn't last very long.
Maybe I misread this in your bio, but were you doing any of the promotion work at the same time that you were a part-time DJ?
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the funny things was I was working at WFOM for Jimmy while I was promoting records because Jimmy knew that had been in radio and he needed a part-time guy at FOM. So I did that. I worked at WFOM on the weekends, on Sunday nights. Well, the guys at WPLO found out about it. And, I worked for Jimmy. I'm getting ahead of myself. Then I moved to QXI. Well, I was working at QXI on the weekends, doing the all-night show on Sunday night, and the guys at PLO found out about it. Well, they got mad because they thought that I was that I was coming over to PLO promoting records and getting access to the program director, and here I was working at QXI, so it was like I was an enemy.
Right.
Anyway.
Was that common of other DJs at the time working? Because it seems like an ideal situation for a record label if you have someone basically on the inside working at a station.
Only if you had any influence on what records got played.
Okay, right.
Because you generally didn't play. You wouldn't dare take records in there and play.
Right.
Play
so it was up
records
to the music director. Obviously.
Yeah, it's
okay.
up to the music director.
Okay.
So but they didn't see it that way at PLO. There was a fierce competition between WPLO and WQXI, and they didn't see it that way. So they complained to Mercury about it.
Also, one of the things I read that was during this time, a group called Cries of London. Were you managing them?
Yeah, a little group from LaGrange. I say little group, a good little group from LaGrange. Some guys that I knew came to me. They knew I worked for Mercury Records, and they said, "Would you manage us?" And I said, "Yeah." And so I managed them, and they played a lot of gigs, and I was able to get on a lot of gigs because of my contacts with the radio stations around the state. Because a lot of times those guys at those radio stations would have dances. That's how they supplemented their incomes. So I would call and say, "Hey, I got a group for you, the Cries of London," and so they would go and play, and they actually opened for the Dave Clark 5 one time. So.
And have you ever managed a band before that, doing any type of work like that? Okay.
No, it's just they just figured since I was in the record business,
right? It was a matter of connections, basically. Good. So you're back in college in 1965.
Yeah.
Did you graduate at that, or did you move on to more radio?
No, I don't remember exactly what happened, but. One of the things that happened was I just didn't. It just wasn't. College just wasn't for me. Mm-hmm. I couldn't keep my mind on it. I had too many. I'd already been to Atlanta. I'd met the Beatles. My mind was just. I couldn't think of anything except there's got to be more to life than living on LaGrange, Georgia. So anyway. I was just too big for my britches, I guess, and so I married my high school sweetheart. I worked at a printing company, and married my high school. Well, I almost got drafted, but I got deferred because of a 1Y or whatever it was, the health. I had a problem with my knee, and so I married my high school sweetheart, and we had moved into our apartment, and I was still working at the printing company. I got a call from a guy in Brunswick, Georgia, at WMOG, and he said, "I'm looking for somebody, and I understand you how it got out. I don't know how he found out about me or whatever."
Yeah, at that point you weren't sitting out
no,
air checks.
I don't think I was. I don't remember really. I did, but it seems to me it just came out of the blue. I could have heard about it and sent him a tape. I don't know. Like I said, that's a long time ago.
Right.
But anyway, I got a job offer at WMOG, and so I took it, and my bride and I moved to Brunswick.
And how many years were you there?
None.
None. Yeah.
I was there about 4 months, and then Romeo Davis, my old friend from Smash Records, called me. He had been promoted to branch manager in Atlanta. He said, "You need to come back to Atlanta and be my promotion man." I said, "Okay." It paid more than the job at WGIG.
Okay, so this was your second stint.
My second stint.
Okay.
A stint there, and I got back to Atlanta and did that for a few months and realized again that radio was really where I belonged. And that came about because I was on a trip to Knoxville, Tennessee, WNOX, calling on my old friend Johnny Perkle, who's still a friend to this day, and met the program director, one of the most colorful guys I ever met in radio, named Rex Miller. And Rex was the program director. Rex weighed about 400 pounds and was probably one of the most talented guys I ever met in the radio business. Funny, I mean, just everything that came out of his mouth was funny. And very worldly. I mean, he read voraciously, so he was very well read. Anyway, Rex, Johnny Perkle asked me for a tape when I was up calling on him promoting records. So I gave him one, and he gave it to Rex, and Rex called me and said, "Why don't you come up and do middays for us at WNOX?" WNOX was a 10,000 watt AM radio station that you could hear at night all up and down the East Coast. But I was on the middays, and it was a good top 40 station. Played a lot of R&B music, and I forgot to mention earlier on, I was particularly fond of the artists that I promoted for Mercury that were R&B artists, because I absolutely loved soul music and rhythm and blues. I mean, that was it from me. So WNOX was a very soulful top 40 station. So I went to work there. So to answer your question, I only worked in the record business again for maybe 3 or 4 months because I quit my job at the Distributors in Atlanta and moved to Knoxville.
Okay. And from what I read, your term at Knoxville ended with saying word online or on air.
It ended because I did something. I did something that was stupid, but I have no excuse. It was just ignorance on my part. Rex and I had gone to an Otis Redding concert in Knoxville, and we had consumed several beers. And on the way from the concert back home, we decided to stop by the transmitter site, which is where the all-night radio station, the all-night show is done from, the transmitter. And we stopped to see the guy who was on the air. His name is Eddie Beacon, another lifelong friend. And Eddie was on the air, and Eddie played a lot of R&B, great R&B music. And he was playing. We were in there, sitting in the other room, and we'd stopped at Crystal and gotten about 25 Crystal hamburgers. And we had about two 6-packs of beer. And Eddie yelled out, "Hey, so-and-so is on the phone." And I'm outside in the office part, and I picked up the phone and said, "So-and-so sucks." Well, this is 1967, I think. And in that year, using the word sucks on the air was tantamount to the most vile curse word you could say today. Today they say it, it's nothing.
All the time.
And that went out over 10,000 watts at 990 on the dial, up and down the East Coast, and was tape recorded by several people who provided the guy who I said sucked with a copy of that, who quickly went to his attorney, and they filed suit against Scripps Howard Broadcasting. And so Rex and I and Eddie Beacon were fired, rightfully so. And whether that guy made any money off that deal, I don't know. But I was blackballed from the business.
So was it a while again before you worked at another station, or were you able to just move on to another one rather
I don't
quickly?
remember the amount of time that it took for me to find another job. I do know that I wound up going back to a town the size of LaGrange to get a job because, my name was Mud.
Right. And was this Winder, Georgia? Where
Actually, I went, till I had one brief stop for a
In
week.
between. Okay.
But I wound up in Winder,
Okay.
with Eddie Beacon,
Okay.
the guy from NOX. He's the one that got me the job there, or suggested I get a job.
Okay. And how long your tenure at there?
I was there for quite a while. I don't remember the exact number of years. It seems like it was probably a year, maybe 2 years. Yeah.
And then at that point, you went back to Atlanta for a period. Is that correct?
No.
Okay, I thought-
I worked in Atlanta part-time at WPLO of all
Right.
places because it was in the country. But I wasn't on the air playing records. I was
okay.
news guy on the weekends.
Oh, okay.
So I drove back and forth to Atlanta on Sundays and did the news on WPLO.
Oh, so it was at the same time when
Yeah,
you were
yeah.
working at Winder? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And since this interview is more focused on Georgia radio, obviously, I know at this point is when you went around the nation working at different stations.
Yeah.
Can you talk about some highlights between, Iowa, Connecticut, Boston, and some of the places
Yeah.
you worked across the country?
I stayed in Winder, and of course, my goal was to get out of there. And I quickly realized that while I was a decent disc jockey, I wasn't a great disc jockey. So therefore, I probably would never, be able to move up to really big stations as a disc jockey. But I really liked the programming aspect. I liked the details of working out and scheduling the records and coming up with promotions and all that stuff. I think I'll try to get a program director's job. So I started sending out tapes. Back then, the only source for finding jobs available to me, at least, was Broadcasting Magazine. And there was an ad for a station in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, for a program director. And I thought, what the heck, I'll send them a tape. I did. Sure enough, the guy calls me and offers me a job. I think, what in the world do I want to go to Iowa for? I'd never been, I think I'd never been to the Midwest. He offered to buy me a plane ticket to come up there. So I flew up there and landed in the middle of a cornfield. And it was like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, And, but I was intrigued by when I got up there and he started talking to me, and I went in the radio station, and I got that vibe that being a program director, at least it was somewhere to start. So I took it and I stayed 3.5 years, and we did extremely well with a little 1,000-watt top 40 radio station, and I had a ball. It was a lot of fun.
And what were some of I know you briefly mentioned, but can you give a little more detail of the duties of a program director?
Well, the first thing I had to do was I had to do the morning show. Whew, that was tough, particularly since I enjoyed having a drink and and hanging around a bar at night. And I worked in a bar, as a matter of fact. Playing records at night because to subsidize my income, because we didn't make much money. If I'm not mistaken, I think I made $100 a week, which wasn't a lot of money, but still, I was married, and it just wasn't a lot of money. And so I worked for this guy named Eli Abedeli, who owned a place called the Sip and Stir right up the street from the station, where my boss, who still to this day is a good friend, Don Weir, sends me a birthday card every year. He's old. I'm old. He's real old. Anyway, Don, every afternoon, Don went to the Sip and Stir, and so if I needed to talk to Don, I had to go to the Sip and Stir to find him, which was a great excuse for me to go and have a couple of beers. But anyway, I forgot where I was and all that, but anyway,
Basically, the duties of a
the
program
program. If I scheduled the records, I did the mornings, Got up a lot of mornings hungover. Well, I'm not proud to say that, by the way. I scheduled the music. I scheduled the disc jockeys. I made sure the production was done, which is recorded all the commercials. I did remote broadcasts. There was anything with basically to do with the internal operations, short of the news, because the news director was separate from me. He was not under my jurisdiction. So that's what I did. And I hired and fired the disc jockeys. Of course, Don always had a finger in that. He always had to approve that. So, but that's pretty much what I did. And I did pretty much what I thought I'd do. And I came up with some pretty good promotions, and that's where I also started reporting to the Gavin sheet and developed a real strong relationship with Bill Gavin. Because we would, at this station, a little station in Iowa, again, I would hear a song, a new song, and understanding what the promotion man was trying to do, I had a great empathy. I enjoyed that part of it a lot. And I would pick songs, I'd hear a song and I'd say, I like that. I think that's a hit. And sure enough, it'd be a hit. Or a lot of times it wouldn't be.
Right.
But I remember the first gold record I ever got was I Think I Love You by the Partridge Family, which just Bell Records absolutely loved me. They thought that I was the greatest because I'm the first person that ever played that song. And Bill Gavin reported it. And it became a huge record. Of course, the fact that it had a hit TV show helped a little bit. But I had a pretty good track record with picking songs. So, I forget what the question was.
Well, leading off of that with the program writer, with your picking the songs, was it basically just a gut feel on them, or was there any particular things that stood out in certain songs that?
I guess I don't know. It was a visceral thing with me. I would hear a song, and if it, I just got a feeling about it, I can't describe it. I would just hear. I can do that today with some songs. There's not a lot of this new music I'll listen to. Right. I will say this. The only time that I really, really miss being on the radio is when I hear a Bruno Mars song. I love Bruno Mars. He is so cool. Unfortunately, he's the only one nowadays that really puts out the kind of music that I really like. Right. I mean, I'll be in my office and sometimes I'll get bored and just click on YouTube and watch one of his videos, and Patty will hear me in the other, and she said, "You're in there listening to those Bruno Mars videos again, aren't you?" Because I think he's just too cool. But that's how. I mean, it's that visceral feeling you get when you hear those songs.
Right, Right. Was it typical of smaller stations to have program director basically serve as the music director as well, was that the case where at a bigger station you would have two, a program director and a music director?
Yes. Okay. At larger stations, and sometimes smaller stations would, but generally the music director was in name only, and it was primarily to keep the record guys away from you, because they can be real pests at times, or could be.
And so can you elaborate a little bit more on the Gavin report and just the way it, I guess the importance of it, or the way it grew over the time that you were
It was really more important than Billboard or Cashbox because it was more immediate. And also it was more intimate.
Was the reporting done the same way between the Gavin report and Billboard? I mean,
Not necessarily.
Do you know who, or
well,
where was Billboard getting their information from?
Well, they were getting, theirs was a combination, I think, it seems to me, if I remember correctly, theirs was based more on sales. Okay. Whereas Bill's was based on sales and requests. Okay. So in other words, because back then, the request line at a radio station, particularly a top 40 station, was your connection to the audience, except for being out in the streets with promotions and stuff. So I think also there was a belief that if you bought full page ads in Billboard or Cashbox, that you got a little bit more favorable treatment. Whereas with Bills, there were no ads.
Right.
It was strictly subscription based. And so I got to know Bill. As he got to know me, I think we developed a relationship, and I'll never forget the first time I met him. I went to one of his conventions in Los Angeles. I persuaded Don Weir to pay my way out there, and I forget what I had bargained with. I think it had something to do with ratings. He told me if we get to this certain level in ratings, then I'll send you to the Gavin thing. And so I went to Los Angeles, and at that time I had just had enough success there that I started thinking about what I'm going to do next. So I said to Bill, "Hey Bill, I'd like to bring a tape of my station and have somebody, one of the big guys, listen to it and tell me what I'm doing right or wrong." And so he said, "I'm sure there'll be plenty of people." I mean, the biggest names of the business went to this thing. So he said, "Sure, we can do that. I'm sure there'll be somebody there." He said, "Just come on and whatever." So that's when I met he and Janet, his wife. And so I got there, and no sooner had I gotten there than Bill called me in my room and said, "Can you come upstairs to my suite? I'd like to talk to you about something." I said, "Oh, sure." I'm thinking, "Oh, great, this is going to be a job offer." I get up there and he says, "We had somebody drop off on a panel that we had scheduled. And we were wondering, since you want people to listen to your tape, how would you feel about taking that tape and playing it in front of all these people and letting them make comments?" And I said, "Sure, I'd love that," being the dumb idiot that I was. As Jimmy Davenport said to me, because I told him, I left that meeting and went and found Jimmy. I said, "You're not going to believe this." And he called me some name that had several words that I won't use. And he said, "Let me just tell you one thing. The only thing you do is keep your mouth shut. Just play your tape and listen. Don't speak." And I thought, well, okay, because Jimmy and I had developed a really close relationship. I mean, he was almost like a second father to me. For everything that my father taught me about being good and righteous and being a good boy, Jimmy Davenport taught me everything. He taught me about all the bad stuff. Not the bad stuff, but he taught me. Well, that's as far as I go. I love him to death. But anyway, so the time came, and by then, after I'd slept on it, I thought, what have I gotten myself into? So I did it. And we went and we got up on the stage, and I mean, all the biggies in the business were there. And they introduced me. I said, "This is John Long from KLWW in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, who contacted me and asked me if he could bring a tape and get some feedback on his station." And they played the tape, and I sat there, and the first thing, it was tightly edited, so it was all the music, the whole songs were edited out. So you hear the very beginning and then the end of the song, and then it would be the next thing. And frankly, to go back and listen to that today, which I don't even have a copy, I don't think, it was pretty boring, And a lot of people got up and said that. But there was one guy who stood up and said, "I think you guys are being a little cruel to him, because the truth of the matter is, if you played a tape of your station, it would sound the same way, because that's all you do too." And his name was John Rook. Now, John Rook had been a very, very successful program director at WLS in Chicago and in either Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, I can't remember. John was well known, and he was also a big consultant at that time. And I was forever indebted to him, and I always sent him a note occasionally, saying, "I'll never forget what the fact that you stood up and said that about me." Well, what that did for me, other than almost causing me to have a cardiac arrest at a very young age, was it made my name instantly known to a whole lot of people who'd never heard of me, or probably would have never heard of me if it hadn't been for that. So it was purely naive on my part to do it, but it was a good move, because I started getting calls from record guys that I'd never heard from before, who wanted to send me records because they started paying attention to my station there. And I knew my name was known to people that I would have never known me from anybody else. Mm-hmm. So when I sent out a tape to somebody, say, "Oh, you're the guy from Gavin," so be good, bad, or indifferent. That was it. So that was that. So that was my experience with Bill and Janet. From that on, I really had a good relationship with Bill, and I was one of his reporters, and I think he respected my ability to pick records, pick hits, and a lot of times mentioned me and said, John Long has picked blah 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 blah, and for whatever that's worth.
Obviously, you weren't in the South at this time, but there was that Southern Music Survey around the time. How was that? It seemed very similar to the Gavin report. Did people view it as a supplement to it, or I guess what's your take on that?
Well, Paul Drew was the editor and founder of that, and he did it with Bill's blessing, because You're right, it was very similar. Mm-hmm. What Paul did was he concentrated on the South, and being based in Atlanta, Georgia, but it also encompassed North, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Florida. I can't remember everybody. We donated, all of the issues, or most all of them, and fortunately they're preserved now. Ann Drew, Paul's widow, was kind enough to give them to the Georgia Radio Hall of Fame, and I of course donated them to Georgia State, because I thought they were so important, because they documented so much that went on, not just music-wise, but also activities at radio stations. So it was important, and while it didn't have the impact that the Gavin did, because it wasn't national, it was very important in the South, very important.
And it was structured the same way as a setup with reporting.
Yeah,
too. Okay.
yeah. There was a certain status to being a reporter for Gavin and for Southern Music Survey. Okay. It meant you get better record service, and it gave you a little bit of prestige,
And I'm assuming some of the stations did both report to Gavin
Absolutely.
As well as the Southern Music Survey.
Yeah, Paul didn't have any problem with that, and neither did Bill.
Okay. It's interesting on there. Speaking of Paul, at this point, you had ended up taking a position in New Haven, Connecticut, and that was with a connection of RKO stations, correct? Or were one of the RKO stations? Actually,
the reason I went to New Haven was because of Paul Drew.
Right.
Paul was a consultant there. He had left Quixie and gone to CKLW, I think, as program director, and then left there and went to WIBG in Philadelphia. Then RKO, Bill Drake hired him to go to Washington to change WGMS, which was a classical AM that they owned in Washington, D.C., to change it over to Top 40. Well, the classical music lovers in Washington raised so much hell about it. And because you're in Washington, D.C., and they can, you raise Cain in Washington, D.C., if you know the right people, you're going to get things done. Well, because they raised so much Cain, RKO backed out of that idea, and that left Paul with no job. So Paul became a consultant. Well, one of his first consulting jobs was WABZ in New Haven. And so Paul remembered me and called me in Cedar Rapids and said, "I'm now consulting WABZ in New Haven, Connecticut." and I'm looking for a program director. Would you be interested? And I said, yeah. He said, send me a tape. I'll send him a tape. He always wanted another tape, so I sent him another tape. And so then I got a call from the general manager. He flew me to New Haven. I went to New Haven. I took the job. I'm making about 3 times as much money as I was in Cedar Rapids. I was moving up as a program director. I got there. I had everything I wanted to do the job. I had all the money I wanted to give away. I had all the money I wanted to spend on new equipment. I had all the money I wanted to hire disc jockeys. It was like a dream come true. I was having more fun and Paul was impossible. I mean, he would call me at 3 o'clock in the morning. Did you hear what the disc jockey just said? No, Paul, I happened to be asleep. Well, he expected you to listen 24 hours a day. Anyway, he's a tough taskmaster. But he taught me so much. Without Paul Drew, my career would have never gone past Cedar Rapids, probably. WABZ became a huge success. Well, about a year into that relationship, Paul got called by the upper echelon at RKO because Bill Drake had left as their chief program director, whatever you call it, vice president of programming. Paul was named, no. Paul got hired to go to KHJ, which was owned by RKO first. He went to KHJ, so that left us with no consultant, except that, guess who became consultant? Kent Burkhardt, my old friend from the Jingle days. I got another story about Kent Burkhardt, but we don't have time for it right now, but if we do later, I'll tell you. Had to do with the record promotion, but Kent became the consultant. Well, by then I was, Kent was easy to work with because he was so different from Paul, but he taught me a lot too. I mean, between the 2 guys that influenced my career more than anybody else, and that was Kent Burkhardt and Paul Drew. And but we'd only been like 3 months, and Paul calls me and says, can you get up to Boston? I said, well, why do what I want to? He said, because they need a program director at WROR-FM, which is WRKO's FM. RKO was the big top 40 up there. ROR was a oldie station, which ran taped format. So I went, and again, it was like I talked to whenever I had a big decision to make, I always called Jimmy Davenport. What do you think I do? He said, how can you turn that down? More money, more prestige, bigger market, So I took the job. It was horrible because RKO was going to sell WROR. At that time, RKO had decided that they were the biggest independent radio corporation in America. They owned a lot of AM and FMs in the same market. Mm-hmm. They wanted more AM. They hadn't gotten on. It hadn't registered with them yet that FM was the thing to come. So their brilliant president decided they were going to sell off all their FMs. So ROR was going to be sold to a guy named Cecil Heftel. Well, there was a big lawsuit filed saying Cecil Heftel should not get that license, and so rather than do it, they just said, okay, well, just forget it. Cecil Heftel said, screw it, I don't want it. Anyway, there they sat with an FM that, first of all, had never done very much in terms of ratings, and that nobody really wanted. It had no staff. It was all on tapes. And here I am going to go to Boston and making a lot more money again, but working for RKO, which was the biggest radio corporation in America. And I thought, and again, Jimmy said, how can you turn him down? Where do you want to go? I said, man, I'd love to go to KSJ one day. I'd love to be the program director of KSJ or KFRC, one of the great RKO stations. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, the only way you're going to do it is if you're inside, because that's the way they do it. So I took the job. I was miserable for 3-4 months. I called Kent. I told him when I left Kent understood why I left. And I called him and I said, Kent, you got to get me out of here. I can't stand, this is not working, because I had nothing to do, because these tapes would just go by themselves. I had a secretary, but I didn't have a staff. It was crazy. So he said, well, I've got a client. I got a new client in El Paso, Texas. I said, okay. He said, it's a Mexican station that's 150,000 watts. I said, what? He said, I'm going to send you a plane ticket. Go down there and talk to the guy. So it was the dead of winter in 1973 when the oil embargo was going on. There was plenty of oil sitting in the Boston Harbor, but you couldn't buy gas anywhere. You had to buy either on odd day or even day, depending on how your license plate ended. So, I mean, it was miserable, and plus snow up to the roof. El Paso, looked like heaven. I flew to El Paso, and I walked into this Mexican radio station, XEROK, X-Rock 80. Now, the transmitter and the tower was located in Juarez. The studio was located in El Paso. And what they didn't tell me was that all the programming was taped. In other words, all the shows were taped a day in advance. Then we had this little guy named Ishmael who would drive them across the border. Well, Ishmael was a courier, so he was paying somebody to get back and forth across the border, because back then, border crossing was very lax. But if you wanted to carry stuff back and forth across, you had to have a license, and that meant paying somebody. But anyway, so I listened to the station, and it sounded like what would soon to become known as an AOR station, because they played a lot of albums. And Kent said, this is not going to work. It's not going to get any ratings. So we want it to be a top 40 station. Well, miserable. I was miserable in Boston. I said, okay, I'll do it. So I went to El Paso, and the staff of guys there, they're all friends of mine. Well, most of them are friends of mine. I mean, not because I say most of them, not because I was enemies with them, but there are a couple of those guys that I still know today, they're still friends today, or I know where they are, that stayed on and tolerated me coming in and changing everything. They had been so proud in their smoke-filled sessions of evening programming design, when they were token up and, hey man, let's play some, this, black, it was supposed to be a cool AOR station. And I turned it into a flaming hot top 40 station. And it wound up generating the highest ratings in the United States of America for a top 40 station in the spring Arbitron. And we were all very proud. It was so much fun because we would tape the shows, and then Ishmael would carry them across the border. And it sounded pretty darn good. You couldn't really, to the casual listener, or even to most listeners, they couldn't tell we weren't live, because we kept it fresh. In other words, we didn't do things like, we didn't give the time, except I think we did something on the top of the hour. I don't know. We didn't give the time. We didn't give the weather, because that would have been forbidden. I mean, that just wouldn't work. So we just kept it focused on the music. And then the jocks, who were very entertaining. Good guys. I mean, just two of the best guys I ever worked with. And it was a great radio station. Well, it had a manager who could not stand the fact that Ken just said, go do what you do best. So I went and did what I did best, and my guys did what they did best, because it was never me who made I didn't do all this by myself. It was because I had a great staff of guys. I mean, you can't be a great football team unless you have good players, and that's what we had. That's what I was lucky enough to have. But X-Rock turned out to be just an incredible radio station. I mean, you could hear it in San Francisco at night, 150,000 watts at 800 on the dial.
So even with it originating from Mexico, it was still an English language station.
Except for at the top of the hour when we did the Mexican ID, which was a little girl who worked at the station, and she came on and we'd play this music, which was part of a Beatles instrumental on the Yellow Submarine soundtrack, and she come on and say, XAROK, what is Mexico? And that was it. The rest of the time it was extra arcadey, and we had hot jingles, and we had, it was great.
With it being in Mexico, was there any regulations that were different than if it had been broadcast out of the States?
It seemed that there were a few things we couldn't do, but I don't remember them being, for the most part, no.
Okay.
Except when the president of Mexico wanted to speak, whenever he wanted to speak, all of a sudden our programming would disappear and El Presidente would be there.
Okay.
I mean, because anytime the president wanted to speak, all the radio stations carried it. So, bam. I mean, so all the advertisers, we'd have to make up all their commercials because, El Presidente spoke. So, but that was about it.
Okay.
It was great. As long as it lasted.
Right, because that
General manager decided he didn't like it because I was getting a lot of credit. We got a lot of front page credit for. We got a lot of print because of the fact that we were the highest rated top 40 radio station in America. He was very jealous of that, so he fired Kent, and then he fired me, and then the staff walked.
Backing up a little bit with that, you had mentioned that it was an automated station.
Yeah.
At that time, was that the norm, or was that cutting edge in the early 70s with stations?
It was more a norm in the FM realm,
Okay.
because most FM stations were all automated on big. In other words, they had these computer-driven automation systems.
And about what time period did the automation start in general? When it became
Gosh.
more popular, I guess?
Well, automation started in radio back in the 60s.
Oh, okay. I
Yeah,
didn't think
and
it was
maybe
that
even
early.
a little before that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't think it was that early.
Most beautiful music stations were automated.
Okay.
That's where Music of Your Life originated.
I'm sure there were advantages and disadvantages of working with an automated type station versus live.
I would have thought so, but the truth of the matter is, when we put the fresh tape on, because we taped it in hour segments, and we rolled the tape and rolled XAROK, Juarez, Mexico, ding, 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 hit the music like that, and then you're just doing your show like you normally would.
Oh, okay.
It's just that you're not doing it live, you're doing it on tape.
Right.
So, but you had to get it in your mind, you're not taping, you are live, you are on the radio.
Okay.
So that, it was
so
a
you
little
get the
bit
same
of a
feel across.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
And we did everything the same way we do it as if we were live,
Okay.
except for the weather and the time.
Right. Okay. So after leaving that station, I know you said you bounced
out of
around
work.
a little bit. You did a little bit of consulting and was at Phoenix for a short time.
Yeah, I consulted B100 in San Diego, which I don't get credit for, but that's fine. Matter of fact, Randy Brown, or Christopher Hayes as he's commonly known, and I went to San Diego and put that station together. That's another long story altogether. But anyway, we put it together and put it on the air, and they put it on the air that next morning. We were there all night long labeling the records, categorizing them and everything. And the disc jockey came in that morning, and and B100 was a tremendously successful station. We were out of work. The staff pretty much scattered and found their own jobs. A couple of people that worked for me went with me to a job in Phoenix, working for Kent Burkhardt, who was consulting a station, KRUX in Phoenix. One of the guys that worked for me in El Paso was the program director, but the general manager there didn't like him and didn't have confidence in him. So she told Kent, he said, find me a PD. And I told Ken, I said, I'll go, but I'm not firing Christopher. I'm not, I'm not going, if I'm going to replace him, he's staying and he's going to be a vital part of what's going on because I'm not going to put him out of work. And he stayed on, and we did great for 6 weeks, and then the owner decided he'd go all news. So we were out of work again.
And one thing I'd read in your bio at that time period, one of the things you did was promotion for Casablanca Records with Kiss on that. And
Kiss? Yeah, I did.
And
I was out of work.
I would like to hear your take, because obviously you said earlier you were more into soul music and R&B and like that, and obviously at that time period, Kiss was rather shocking. I just like your take on what you thought of that. I mean,
what I thought about doing that?
Yeah.
I thought this is a way for me to make some money and feed my family while I was at work.
Right.
So I was, I'd be ill-advised to say, who in the hell is Kiss?
Right.
I didn't care for Kiss. But they were hot. And the national promotion director, the reason they did it was because they would curry favor with me, so that if I wound up getting a bigger job somewhere, I would owe them.
Okay.
Even though it was never stated, that's what the purpose was.
Right.
And frankly, I never bought into it. And I told them right up front, if you think this is, if you think, don't expect unreasonable things from me, because it's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. I'll do this if you're going to help my family. And that's the only reason I'm doing it. Because I didn't care for Kiss.
Right.
I don't today. I don't understand why people like them. But that's how I fed my family in the few months that I was out of work.
Right.
So
with you never let your taste in music get involved with work. With obviously.
I would have never played a Kiss record.
Right.
And frankly, I don't know that I played a whole lot of them even after that were oldies, that were hits. I mean, if they were hits, I'm not going to not play them because I don't like them, because I couldn't do that.
Right.
I mean, I played a lot of records I didn't like. I got a lot of heat from people who I waited. I was maybe the last person in America that played something because I hated it or didn't like it. So, but if it was a hit, I'd play it.
Right.
I mean, I had to think of the audience first.
Right. Get the ratings in.
Yeah.
So at this point, you ended up
Went to Jacksonville.
Right.
Went to work for Stan and Sis Kaplan, two legendary owners who own WOS in Chicago, and not Chicago, but Charlotte, and they own WAP in Jacksonville, which is a legendary station. They needed a program director. Jay Thomas was the group program director, if you can call two stations a group. Jay was, and that's how I first met Jay Thomas, who just recently passed away. I went to Jacksonville, and WAP had been tremendously successful as a big top 40 station, another 50,000 watt station that you could hear up and down the East Coast at night, because in the daytime their signal was not that great, but at night at 690 on the dial, when your tower or your signal array is configured so that it goes up and down the East Coast, which was by design, you could hear. We'd have listeners in New Jersey, or as far away as Miami and Cuba. But anyway, I got the job there, and my job was to fix it. Kent again was the consultant, although Stan and Sis did whatever they wanted to do, and there was a lot of grief. I fought a lot of battles there to do things the right way, but we triumphed and wound up again scoring very, very high ratings, particularly when we hired a guy named Greaseman, who was legendary, who became legendary. And he was the morning guy. And about a year and a half later, they came to me and said, "We want you to come to Charlotte." I didn't want to go to Charlotte. I didn't want to be right under their noses. I knew Stan, I knew how they operated. It was bad enough when they fly into town and Stan would walk in the control room and tell the disc jockey, "All right, give away $100 on the air right now." wouldn't come to me and say, "Hey, here's $100. Tell your guy to get away." They go walk in the control room and do it, which was fine. They own the radio station; they could do it. But again, I'm the program director. Anyway, that's the kind of stuff that I had to put up with. So anyway, I said I don't want to go. I said I'm not going to go, and I fully expected to be fired, but I wasn't. And within 2 months, I got a call from Paul Drew wanting me to go to WHBQ in Memphis.
And was Paul still associated with RKO at this time? Okay.
But he wasn't running the RKO station in Memphis because the general manager didn't like him. Okay. So they had a consultant.
Just I would like to touch on a thing with RKO. Were they the biggest, I guess, corporation that owned numerous stations? And what other organizations like RKO owned numerous stations, or the bigger ones?
ABC,
okay.
NBC. At that time, I don't think CBS wasn't in top 40. They're talking about. There were a couple of other companies that had pretty good stations, but none. I mean, we're talking about San Francisco, LA, Chicago, New York, Boston, Fort Lauderdale, and Memphis.
Okay.
We were on the bottom of the totem pole. But that was 7. You could only own 7.
Oh, okay.
The FCC wouldn't let you own more than 7. And in many of those markets, they used to have FM stations, but again, in their brilliance, they decided that FM was never going to amount to anything more than a closet radio station playing beautiful music. So let's sell those suckers. So anyway, yeah, RKO was
okay.
RKO was the pinnacle. If you worked for RKO, you were cooler than could be. I mean, that was it. I mean, a lot of that, and I say that was for me and for other guys that I worked with. There were other people that would say the same thing about NBC or CBS. You know, they'd say, "Oh, no, you know, I worked for ABC. I worked for WLS in Chicago. You know, ABC." Well, guess what? I got a job offer from ABC, and I turned it down. I mean, Rick Sklar called me and wanted me to come to fly to Puerto Rico to meet with the managers down there because they wanted to hire me to be a program director for ABC, and I wouldn't go because I knew what they were all about. That was too much corporate. And RKO was pretty loosey-goosey.
Okay.
So.
The reason I ask that is because it seems like nowadays majority of the stations are owned by various companies. They aren't,
About 3.
Aren't independent stations anymore.
Oh, there aren't many independent stations.
Yeah.
There are a few. But
Okay.
back then it was mom and pop stations. And again, you could only own 7.
Okay.
So now when they passed in 96, when they deconsolidated, or when they whatever they did in 96, thank you, Bill Clinton, he said, you can own as many as you want.
Okay.
That's when Clear Channel, which used to be J-Core, which then became Clear Channel, which now is iHeart. It's when Cumulus started their acquisition, and I forget who else owns. I'm not as in tune with it as I used to be.
Right. But it seemed like that starting today, it made more sense to keep it down to 7 stations, like I said, to make it more even playing field compared to nowadays. Is my impression off of it. So, but
yeah, it was a different business altogether. It wasn't controlled by the money, and the reason it's controlled by the money nowadays is because the prices. When Clinton signed the bill allowing everybody to own them, all of a sudden the prices went up for radio stations. Well, they went up to a point where they were it's unbelievable the amount of money that was paid for radio stations that could never be paid back. The debt ratio now is unbelievable. iHeartMedia, which was Clear Channel, which was J-Core, they're juggling their debt right now. They keep they're playing with smoke and mirrors to stay alive because they owe so much money they'll never pay it back. And what they're hoping for, I don't know. Cumulus finally is almost broke. They're almost dead. Their stock is like $1.
really,
I got some friends that bought Cumulus. They thought that was going to be the greatest thing in the world. And they just cry, oh man, I've got so much money tied up in Cumulus stock. I own so many shares now. What in the world's going to happen to all my money, you know?
So, circling back around with the RKO, with you ended up in Memphis.
Yeah.
And two things seem significant at that station. One, Rick Dees, who was quite popular, worked there. But then also, and I'll ask you to elaborate on both of these. But Rick Dees first, and then also I find it interesting with, I know you weren't involved with it, but it had happened before, but the mail fraud charges rating, and my interest is with how the rating diaries actually worked in that process of...
Back then, Arbitron mailed out diaries to homes that they had randomly picked.
Okay.
If you got a diary, you got a diary for every person in your family. The idea was that you write down what you listen to, and then you mail it back into Arbitron. And they tabulate it, and that's how you got the ratings.
And you were just writing down what station you listened to?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, what time you listened, what time and what station. And they were sent by the mail, and the big, at some point when Top 40 got so competitive, guys like Buzzy Bennett, who was a huge program director, very successful program director, he's the one that sort of pioneered stealing diaries and filling them out yourself. He never got caught and prosecuted, and he's dead now, or he disappeared. Nobody knows whatever happened to him. But he bragged about it publicly at a convention, at a Gavin convention in St. Louis, by the way, or Kansas City, I think it was. Bragged about it. And when the Beatles came to Atlanta, when I worked at WQXI, I met a guy whose name was George Klein, who worked for WHBQ in Memphis. And George and I took pictures of each other with the Beatles, and we swapped our interview tapes, and we became friends. I replaced George at WHBQ. I replaced him under the shadow of an investigation where they found that a friend of his, who was a postman, had diverted some diaries, allegedly, into his possession, which he then had filled out for WHBQ, and WHBQ had the best rating book they'd had in years, which was very mysterious to a lot of people. And when they started investigating, that's when it all came out. That's how I got hired. HBQ needed a program director. Well, talk about, going somewhere under a veil of, a cloud hanging over you.
Right.
I mean, but I just thought to myself, well, I don't do that. What I earn, I earn honestly. Mm-hmm. So I said, I'm not worried about it. And they also dangle money in front of me. And HBQ had always been the farm team. If you wanted to work for RKO Radio as a disc jockey, you took a job at HBQ in Memphis, because then you might get promoted up the ladder as a program director, or and a lot of guys who got PD jobs there also went on to, because George was program director for a short time, for the first time, only right before I took over. He'd always just been a jock. But other guys had climbed. Anyway, so I took the job, and the thing about it was that I knew that George did it. The reason I knew it is because he told me he did it at a convention in Kansas City, the same one that Buzz Bennett spoke at, because we were outside all talking, and he said, yeah, we did the same thing. He said, I got a friend who we were supposed to, he got me $10 or $15, whatever. Well, I made the mistake, and I say it's a mistake because I regret now getting involved in all that. I didn't do it because I thought it was the right thing. I just happened to absent-mindedly or drunkenly say, oh yeah, George told me he did that. Well, boy, that's all they wanted to hear. The general manager said, what? And the next thing I know, I'm sitting in a room full of New York lawyers who are saying, tell us about when George Klein... Well, I had to go to federal court and testify against my friend George Klein. which I always regret because George wasn't the kind of, I mean, it's stupid to say, but he wasn't the kind of guy that, I mean, George's biggest, his worst crime was telling girls that he was friends of Elvis's, one of Elvis's friends, which he was, in order to get sexual favors from him, you know. So, but anyway, so I wound up taking the job, and I wound up having to testify, which I regretted having to do. But it was my fault because I opened my mouth. I should have kept my mouth shut. Anyway, I took the job knowing full well that I was going up against WMPS in Memphis, which had huge ratings. Even with WHPQ's ill-gotten gains, they couldn't win mornings because there was a guy sitting across the street at WMPS whose name was Rick Dees, who had a record out called Disco Duck, which, they'll talk about a song I didn't want to play on the radio, but yet I played it. That was one of them. I took the job, and within 2 weeks, Rick got fired because he played his own record on the air. Well, I get a call from the general manager. He says, Rick Dees just got fired. Do you want to hire him? I said, absolutely. Don't do anything till I get there. So I got there, and we sat down, and we negotiated with Rick. He and I hit it off immediately, and we hired Rick. We couldn't put him in the air for 3 months, but we did a lot of promotion saying he was coming, and we wound up being the top-rated black station in Memphis, WDIA, which had been #1 for years. We cleaned their clock. But it was because of Rick. I mean, I had a good lineup afterwards, but hiring Rick was a great coup. And we paid him a lot of money. And he stayed for 2.5 years. And then I get a call one day from the program director at KXJ in Los Angeles. He says, I want Rick to come do mornings for me. Will you let me have him? Because that's kind of the way we did. We kind of respected one another. We wouldn't do things. And I said, I wasn't going to say no because, I mean, I knew Rick was, at that time, was dating or married to, I think he was dating a gal who did voices for cartoons in Los Angeles. Used to do work on Jonathan Winter's show. And I knew he wanted to go. He really wanted to be, he wanted more hit records, but he never had any more. But he really wanted bigger things. And it was stupid for me to say no, because then, you know, he would have been an enemy and not a friend. Well, I'd rather have a friend than an enemy. And so he went, and we hung on for a while, but it finally caught up with us. So Rick's a great guy. He and I are good friends still.
Really?
Yeah.
So you worked there through 79?
Through 80.
80, okay.
No, through 79, right. Yeah,
79, yeah.
Yeah, I left in 80. The general manager at WHPQ went to Houston to KULF, and he called me one day. Well, first of all, I got fired at HPQ because I didn't get along with the sales manager, who, for the whole time that I was program director, he and I didn't see eye to eye, and he was extremely jealous of the fact that anything I wanted, I got. I mean, when you command that kind of numbers, it gives you some power. Now, I didn't abuse it. I mean, I only did. I mean, when I asked the general manager, hey, do you mind if I give away a Corvette? I mean, you know, I expected him to say no. He said, fine, let's see if we can turn it into a sales promotion, which we did. We went to the Chevrolet dealer and we worked it out. And, you know, he got something and we got a Corvette. But the sales manager didn't like me. And in all honesty, my personal behavior was not above reproach. I was doing a lot of things that I shouldn't have done. I'm very lucky that I made it through that period of my life because the temptations was there from a lot of places, the record business included. Drugs were rampant. A program director with any success at all, could pretty much get what he wanted. I had to walk a very tight rope to be careful because I was constantly being confronted with situations which had I taken advantage of, could have very easily gotten me in jail probably, or gotten me in trouble. And I'm very fortunate that I escaped all that. That's not to say I didn't do some things that I'm not really, really proud of. But I was having a ball. And when things are going that well and things are going your way, you forget about, the way you were raised and the mores that you were taught, and you just sort of, I got caught up in it, and it was going on all around me, and the disco era was going on, and it was a crazy time, it was nuts.
Yeah.
So, but I'm here today, by the grace of God.
So by the mid-'80s, you came back to Georgia to work at some various stations.
Yeah.
I think, is there any points you'd like to touch on that? Because if
I came back because I had pretty much run out of gas. After Houston, I went to Minneapolis for a brief period of time. I went to work for a station that Kent consulted, Kent Burkhardt. But that didn't work out, and I went back to Houston. That didn't work out. My marriage fell apart. I came back, and of all things, I got a job offer to go and manage a station in LaGrange. And I did that for about 6 months. I then left and went and managed a station in Albany for a while. That didn't work out. I worked to Florida and worked for the Florida Radio Network for a while. Went to Mississippi, went to Chattanooga, got out of the business, came back to Georgia, worked in the automobile business for a while. Then I sent a tape to Fox 97 in Atlanta. I got hired to be the night disc jockey at WFOX in Atlanta in 2000. I worked there for about 2 years, and then there were a lot of changes going on within Cox Broadcasting at that time, and they let me go. And I did a few more things. I went to Columbus and managed a station. Then I became the group manager for some stations out of Macon. And then it was time for me to do something else entirely altogether, and namely retire. Mm-hmm. So I moved to the coast of Georgia and retired. And Sam Hale, who had worked with the WQXI in Atlanta, and I had remained friends, and we were talking about Jimmy Davenport, who had passed away. And we said, one of us said, it's too bad Jimmy's not in the Georgia Music Hall of Fame, which at that time recognized a lot of people who were in radio and also in the music business. And Jimmy had gotten out of the radio. He'd sold WFOM and become a promotion man, and had also been very influential in country music early on because his dad was the general manager of WTJH in Forest Park, or I think it was Forest Park, or East Point. And so anyway, we said it was too bad he's not in there. Well, Georgia Music Hall of Fame fell apart. And one of us said, we need a Georgia Radio Hall of Fame. So Sam said, well, let's do it. So we did. We formed it. And I said, okay, I'll pick 3 guys. You pick 3 guys. And with that'll be our board of directors. The first person I called was Harley Drew from Augusta, who I my first promotion, the first guy I ever promoted a record to. And a couple other guys. And Sam picked a couple of guys. And we formed the Georgia Radio Hall of Fame in 2007. Never dreaming that it would do much more than just recognize guys who did much with the radio, Georgia radio. In 11 years, it has grown to, it took on a life of itself. It even had a museum for a brief period of time in St. Mary's, and it continues to thrive today.
Do you know at this point how many inductees there are?
Over 100.
Okay.
Over 100 people. While we're doing this, tomorrow night, we do our 11th annual induction thing, and we're inducting some guys. John Jacobs Jr., who from Gainesville, who founded a broadcasting empire that exists to this day. Talk about an independent operator. Mm-hmm. The Jacobs family has they have a group of stations in Gainesville. They're an independent operator. They've somehow they've survived in all this, consolidation and everything. Another guy is a guy named Bob Watson, who was at WSB in the early 1940s, who I think became the first disc jockey in Georgia. He went to Elmo Ellis and said, "Hey, I think we could have a late night show playing the hits of today on WSB." And so he started doing Platter Party, and he played Frank Sinatra and Mel Torme and all the big hits of that time. They'd come into town and go on the air with him. I mean, we got pictures of him with Bob Hope and all these stars and everything. It's a lot of fun. I make no money off of it. I am reimbursed for some expenses, but I have no salary. There's never been any salary for anybody. It's all been paid for by the members. We make a little bit of money. Sometimes we make a little bit of money on our annual events, or sometimes we break even. And we've got some very nice, very, very generous benefactors who write us checks. I don't know what the future is going to be. The museum had to close in March of this year because the city of St. Mary's didn't have any more room for us. We grew. When I got the donation of 200 radios, I knew it was time for us to move into a bigger place. So I went to them and I said, "Hey, we need more space." And they said, "We don't have anything." So I started looking. This was a year and a half ago, and we have yet to find anything. We're hopeful that we will, because we have 5 storage rooms full now. One of them full of 200 radios, and these are antique radios that are irreplaceable. I mean, they're just beautiful, and we've got a lot of memorabilia. A lot of it we've donated to Georgia State. And by working with you, we were able to set up the history of radio broadcasting in Georgia, which all I did was supply the stuff. You did all the work. And I'm very proud of that. And I'm very proud of all the new things that are coming along with that too. To me, that part of it has really become more important to me than the actual inductions. I mean, those are important. Believe me, they're important, because people say, "Well, why you don't get paid? You're not in the Hall of Fame. Why do you do this?" And I'll tell you why. It's because when a family gets up there and we give them a medallion and a certificate and recognize their family member for what they did in radio, and they stand there and they tell these wonderful stories about how their father or their brother or their sister was such a big star in their household, and all the things that they did in radio, that means more to me than anything else. That's what makes it worthwhile to me.
Right.
I really that just fills my heart, And I don't say that for any other reason except that that's the honest to God truth. I mean, that gives me a great amount of pleasure to be able to see the recognition of these people who, like myself, back in the day, radio was everything.
Well, I think that's a good way to wrap this up. Do you have anything else you'd like to add to it?
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, you're very welcome, and I thank you for willing to participate in this.
I look forward to a continuing long and healthy relationship with Georgia State.
Great.
All right.
Thank you very much.